Thank you for joining us for today's AWS in Spotlight webinar on research. My name is Nilüfer Viljanen, Marketing Lead for Public Sector Nordics and Baltics at AWS. I'm joined today by Phil Eyles, Lead for Bioinformatics Development, National Genomics Infrastructure, SciLife Lab in Sweden, and Niklas Metallo, Senior Data Scientist at AWS. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box. We'll bring up the questions to our speakers at the end of each presentation. In case we don't get to go through all the questions, our speakers will get back to you with the responses on email. And also the presentations will be available after the webinar, as well as a recording of this webinar. Now, without further ado, I would like to leave the stage to Phil.
Brilliant. Thank you for the introduction and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. It's really nice to kind of get an opportunity to chat about some of our experiences within research using AWS and the cloud and some of the things that we're excited about. So yeah, my name is Phil Eyles. I work in Sweden at SciLife Lab with Science for Life laboratories within the National Genomics Infrastructure. SciLife Lab is actually a collaboration between 4 Swedish universities, but it's a national infrastructure for anything to do with the life sciences. There are research groups affiliated with SciLife Lab. There's also technology platforms, and within those platforms, facilities. And where I work at the National Genomics Infrastructure, we are one such platform and facility, and we offer genomics services to researchers all over Sweden and globally. So I appreciate that not everyone in the audience is probably necessarily working with genomics, and so a very quick refresher on what I'm talking about when I say this. So going back to biology, going back to basics, you're made up of cells, and you have the average adult has around 30 to 40 trillion cells or so there. They're very tiny. They're about 25 micrometers in size on average. They vary quite a lot. And inside most of your cells, you have DNA. And the DNA is actually packaged up in the nucleus, which is an even smaller part. It's a really microscopic little fraction of your cell. And all of your DNA that you contain is in a single cell is called your genome. And your genome is the same in basically all the cells in your body. There's exact copies of the same DNA. And so when we talk about genomics or your genome, this is kind of what we're referring to as your blueprint. This DNA is packaged up like outrageously small, and there's a lot of it in every single cell. In fact, if you strung out all the different pieces of DNA in a single cell and lined it up, it would be about 2 meters long. And when you think about how many cells you have, that's a lot of DNA in your body. It's about a quick back of the envelope calculation, and gives you about 80 billion kilometers of DNA all wound up inside you in those kind of 40 trillion cells that you have. For sense of scale, that's about twice the diameter of the solar system. So DNA is an amazing molecule, and it encodes a vast amount of information. So in practice, what we do is we work with kind of these samples that we get from researchers, which involves a lot of kind of moving around small volumes of kind of clear liquid, manipulating them very, very carefully, changing temperatures, adding enzymes and different chemicals to manipulate these samples until we end up with a bit of DNA that we can actually work with, and we put that onto one of these machines. And these are some of our high throughput sequencing machines, which we run in our lab. We run lots of different types, but these guys give us the highest output. And inside this big kind of machine that sits there is the critical piece of machinery is this thing, which is called a flow cell. Some very, very clever optics, electronics, computing and stuff take the liquids that we put into this and convert this into decode the sequence of that DNA. So the A's, T's, C's and G's, figure out what order those are going in, and try to reconstruct some of the information that we can then use to do research. This thing is about the size of my hand, and it can generate a colossal amount of data. So it does lots of this type of sequencing gives you lots and lots of small pieces of DNA kind of in parallel, sometimes called massively parallel sequencing, and gives about 3,000 million of these short reads, which sums up to about 900 gigabase base pairs. So it's a lot of output, and a lot of zeros. So to give some context, one of these you can sequence the genome of about 24 people, and you can each of those people 30 times over. So yeah, there's a lot of data coming off these things, and this technology is really advancing rapidly. Many of you will have probably heard of Moore's law, the rule of computing, where the price of computing power halves every unit time, and the price of sequencing DNA is far outstripping Moore's law. So just in the time that I've been working with genomics, there's been a huge revolution in the kinds of experiments we can do, and the cost just drops and drops. So at the National Genomics Infrastructure, we work with these projects. We work with researchers all over Sweden, like I say. In 2019, we took in close to 60,000 different samples, biological samples. It's not just sequencing genomes of people. We do all kinds of things. We work with bacteria and environmental samples, wastewater, all kinds of things. And it's not just decoding a sequence. We can generate quantitative readouts of how these organisms are behaving and all kinds of things. But we do a lot of different projects and a lot of different samples. When you actually sum up the amount of DNA sequencing we're doing on these machines, it works out a just amazing number, again, with 10 to the 12 and a lot of zeros. But it basically means that we're doing the equivalent of one human genome every 2 minutes, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So it's a massive amount of data that we take off this machines and we need to make sense of. In terms of computing numbers, this is equivalent to around 320 terabytes of data. This is processed data, which we delivered to our users in 2019. And this is like the end product, where we take this vast quantity of raw data, we refine it, and we try and make it into something which is kind of biologically interesting, and that's what we deliver. The cluster that we use has about 2 petabytes of working storage. So this is a fairly big operation. We're not the biggest sequencing center in the world by any stretch, but we're one of the leading centers in Europe. What makes this quite interesting for me, I work with the bioinformatics, as we call it, the data analysis side of all this. We sit next to the lab, but we work very closely with them, and we have to try and make sense of all of this data. And one of the things that's quite challenging is that it's not a smooth, continuous, predictable flow of data. You can see here that the output of data that we were generating and delivering to our users over the last couple of years is very, very uneven. And this is because we can't control when people come to us with research projects or how big those projects will be. And so we have orders of magnitude differences in the capacity of our computing that we need in order to be able to process this. This is particularly difficult when we come to planning and procuring the kinds of compute power that we're going to need for the future. And in fact, we're in the middle of this right now. We're planning for the next 5 years with the grant money that we've been awarded and how we're going to be able to handle this data. And so the approach we're now thinking at, because it's so difficult to estimate what we're going to need, how the technology is going to change in 5 years and how the analysis is going to change in 5 years. What we're hoping to do this time around is have like a hybrid solution, which is fairly common, where we want to have a fairly small HPC, regular cluster, which will run on site, but we want that to be small enough that we can be sure we'll be using it near its full capacity most of the time. And then when those spikes come in, we want to be able to push them out into cloud computing so that we can rapidly respond to anything that's big and unexpected that comes in. I'm sure many of you in the audience will be familiar with unexpected changes with the past year. So you can appreciate that this is something that would be really valuable for us to be able to just respond rapidly and not form like a huge queue on the HPC, but not waste resources by having the cluster which is sat there empty for half the time. When we look further afield, this is going to come around again in another 5 years. We're going to have to, again, do some more planning there. And so by 2026, at the end of this period, we want to be ready to kind of hit 100% cloud computing, which we think is going to be the best way for us to go. Not only does that allow us to respond to surges, but it also should make it much easier for us to have more fine-grained tracking of the analysis we do and the costs involved. And also importantly, it's essentially infinitely parallel. So if we take in a lot of big samples at once, we can just kind of scale out and run all of them, and they should take about the same amount of time as if we just had one or two. So faster and hopefully cheaper. So that's what we're aiming for. What have we done so far? One of the first things that we did when we started approaching this problem of how to use cloud computing was we spoke to some experts at AWS, and they pointed us in the direction of the AWS Research Cloud Program. And if you're involved in research and you want to get started on AWS, I recommend follow this URL and give it a read and fill in the form. It doesn't take very long at all. What this gives you and gave us is three things which are really critical for us using the cloud. Firstly, we're a university backed, so it's not really easy for us to use credit card billing, and this fast tracks you towards using invoice-backed billing, which keeps our economy department happy. Also, normally when you're using AWS, there's a charge associated with downloading your data and getting it out of the cloud. But if you sign up for the RCP, then there's a waiver to basically wipe out that charge, which can make a big difference. And finally, when you sign up, you get access to a researcher's handbook, which is kind of a giant PDF, but most of it is kind of worked examples of how different people in different fields of research are using cloud. And what's really important is the start of this tells you how to sign up to AWS, how to get all these things, what steps you need to do in what order, and what the best practices are. And for someone like us, like I came to AWS knowing basically nothing about how to do this. We're not experts in kind of compute and cloud. And so this gave us a really nice introduction about how we should be doing this properly. So check that out, it was really good. This whole process took us filling the forms, then chatting to AWS to get the thing set up. Took us a couple of weeks. It's not very long at all, so it's quite low overhead. The second thing we did was we were pointed in the direction of this credits for research program, which is run by AWS, which is basically kind of AWS, if you fill in an application, can give you credits to use the cloud for free. And one of the things that stated the reasons for this is to do proof of concept and benchmarking and thinking about moving to the cloud, basically. And this is exactly what we wanted to do, so it was perfect. So this research credits gave us a chance to play around without being too scared and kind of feeling free to try lots of different things out without spending a lot of our own kind of research grant money. So again, I recommend checking that out. So I'm now going to kind of go through a few of the things that we've done over the last couple of years with these credit programs and kind of the things we're building up to be able to run our genomics analysis on AWS and just kind of generally at the national genomics infrastructure in Sweden. One of the first things we realized, one of the mantras that you hear with cloud computing is you should bring the analysis to the data and not the other way. And it's a fantastic reason for using the cloud. But what we realized is that nearly all the analyses we do, you need these kind of reference genomes. If you're going to compare this data against the reference human genome, you need to have the reference human genome there, and it's got a non-negligible file size. So we needed to move all these references onto the cloud so that we could easily make use of them. And we did that with the help of AWS by adding it to the AWS registry of open data. You can see the URL at the bottom, and there's loads of different data sets there. So if you're interested in doing using the Cancer Genome Atlas, for example, or all these different open source large data resources, you can find them there on the registry of open data, free to access for anyone. And indeed, even if you're not using AWS, you can use AWS iGenomes by just downloading it. It's an S3 bucket that sits there without any authentication need, so anyone can download it. And in fact, we have the paths hard-coded into our analysis pipeline, so if anyone tries to run them on a different site, will automatically just fetch those iGenomes references that they need as soon as they try and run the pipeline. So it's very convenient and it's very simple. We just took an existing resource that we were using, the Illumina iGenomes, which was curated by Illumina, and kind of instead of having these huge tar files on an FTP server, put them onto S3 and made them available. I also put together a little web interface, which you can find here, which just kind of has drop downs showing you what's available, so you can easily navigate that, and it gives you some little commands to kind of download the data locally. I, until now, have never known whether anyone else used AWS iGenomes or whether it was just me. I found it really useful. But only a few weeks ago, Aaron Chu from AWS contacted me over email and offered to pull the historical access data for this S3 bucket, which I thought was really interesting. And I love seeing this. You can see how the usage has grown over time. This is a stacked plot, so the total peak is nearly 70 terabytes of data transferred in a single month. And you can see that a lot of people are doing what I was saying, pulling it to their own local networks, to their own local clusters. But then more and more people are starting to use it with analysis on the cloud on AWS. The total file size of all of these references is about 5.5 terabytes. So at first thought, I thought, oh, this is only someone pulling the whole data set maybe kind of 12, 15 times. But actually, most people are pulling a very, very small fraction. They're not interested in the 32 other species there. They just want human, and they don't want all of human. They just want this specific tool for human. So to give you an idea, the star index, which is very commonly accessed, is about 30 gigs. And when you take that into account, this is hundreds of thousands of people using this resource. Very cool. Okay, so we had the reference data we needed. We had the credits to run some test analysis. The key really to this operation for us was to use a tool which is called Nextflow, which is a workflow manager. And Nextflow handles all of the complexity to do with managing an analysis workflow. It's come from the genomics community, but it can work for anything. You write an Nextflow script and you write these processes, which are kind of steps within your workflow. And each one of these takes inputs, gives outputs, and then just has an arbitrary bash script. It can be anything. If you can run it on a command line, you can build it into a Nextflow pipeline. These processes, you can define memory and you can define requirements, and you can also bundle up software requirements using Docker, Singularity, Conda, and a few others, so that all you need to have installed is Nextflow and Docker, and you can run basically any Nextflow pipeline. Nextflow then sorts out all of the complicated backend stuff wherever you're running, not just on AWS, but on Kubernetes, on Slurm, on your local cluster, or even just running on your local laptop. And so this means you write your analysis workflow once. All the interesting bits, all the scripts and everything you write once, you can test it on your laptop. And when you're ready, you can run it on your HPC cluster, or you can run it on the cloud. And the workflows are truly portable across computational systems, which is something that I had previously thought was basically impossible until I saw this. This has been a complete revolution for the way that we work. All of the analysis we do now pretty much is built into Nextflow pipelines. And in fact, so just pointing out that we run these workflows on our cluster using Singularity and Slurm, so using a batch scheduler on our regular HPC, but we can also use Docker and AWS to run the same workflow on the cloud. These workflows that we built were so portable that other people started using them, which is brilliant. They're all open source and then free for anyone to use, but it started kind of really growing into a community. And so we came up with this name of NF Core with a few other collaborators around the world. And now this is, you can see the website in the bottom. We've got this fully fledged community effort now to collect best practice analysis pipelines built using Nextflow. As of today, we have 40-something pipelines available. 24 of those are kind of stamped with stable releases, so good to go, spanning many different applications within genomics, but also increasingly we're seeing pipelines for proteomics, for image analysis. So we're not limiting to any specific field. And we kind of ship lots of different helper tools and guidelines. So we help developers write these pipelines, and we also help people run these pipelines. We have a lot of automation to help us with this because it's a lot of code to manage. And we do things like continuous integration testing, so that whenever anyone edits a pipeline, it automatically runs a tiny test data set on GitHub and makes sure that the code isn't broken anymore. One of the things we realized a little while ago is that this tiny test data set is great to check that there isn't like a syntax error in the code, but it's difficult to capture the reality of a full-scale test data set. So it might be working locally with this kind of 2 megabyte file, but when you try and run it on an actual full-scale data set, you might get some different errors. So something we're quite keen to do is kind of these full-scale tests on actual realistic, publicly available data. And so this year, with the help of another AWS grant, we've set up this kind of automated full-scale testing for NF Core pipelines, which will soon be for every NF Core pipeline whenever it's released. This isn't quite live yet, but we're just building this at the moment. That on the NF Core website, we're making all of this data publicly available. And so you can go to a pipeline and kind of just click through to example output and for a given release of that pipeline and just view any of it in your browser. This is great to give researchers an idea of whether the pipeline's producing the kinds of things that you want, but it's also brilliant for benchmarking different releases of a given pipeline. The example showing here is a pipeline called Viral Recon, which was built this year, basically in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the images that are coming up here are reconstructions of a COVID genome. So this is kind of very relevant real world data that we're testing on, which is publicly available. It's really exciting to see this. Something else we've added this year is to try and, we've got a big focus within NF Core and with these pipelines to make them as user-friendly as possible. So we've started to standardize the way that the pipelines describe their various inputs. And you'll find that some of the pipelines, this one for doing chromatin immunoprecipitation analyses, have a button up there saying launch. And if you follow this link, it will take you to a structured form with all of the different inputs for that pipeline, together with all the help text and explaining everything. Once you finish filling that in, you get a command that you can run on your laptop or on your HPC system, and it will pull those things that you put into the form and kick off the pipeline for you. So it's very user-friendly. But what's really nice is we've also managed to start integrating this with other tools outside of NF Core. And the one that we're starting to use a lot now is called Nextflow Tower. Now, this is a tool written by the same team who wrote the main Nextflow program. And it's basically a website which runs, and it can listen to ongoing pipelines to give you a nice kind of dashboard showing all the different pipelines that are running, but it can also trigger them as well and launch pipelines for you. So here I've filled in that form for the ChIP-seq pipeline, and I've clicked the little button that says launch and tower, and it's opened this up in a new tab with all of that pre-filled in for me. I can then hit launch, and Tower has created an environment on AWS for me. All I need to do is just have an AWS account number and an IAM account to log in with a username and password. It's created the environment for me using AWS Batch, and it's now running that pipeline on cloud for me. And I can just see through this dashboard the execution log and all the different steps and how far it's got. So this is really user-friendly. You don't even need to touch a command line anymore. And Nextflow and Nextflow Tower are abstracting away all of that complexity of using a cloud for us. So this is what we're planning now for the next kind of 5 years or so. This is where we want to go. We want to use Nextflow Tower to coordinate and also to launch our analysis runs, either locally on our small HPC using Slurm, or on the cloud using AWS. Nextflow itself has an API, sorry, Nextflow Tower has an API, so we can both launch and monitor workflows, and it can automatically communicate with our underlying LIMS systems, which keep track of all of our samples moving through the lab. So the hope is that by hopefully the next time we come around, we'll be able to see that data has come off the sequencing machine, that we have new samples ready for processing, and then that will automatically trigger a run, which can be run either locally or on the cloud, depending on usage and other parameters. And then that can be communicated back so we can deliver that data to the user. This level of automation and user friendliness means that we can continue to scale and produce more data for more users in a really kind of secure, really reproducible and stable manner. Right, that's it for me today. Hopefully that gives you a glimpse into the kinds of things that we're thinking about at the genomics infrastructure in Sweden and how we work with our research data. You can get hold of me in the top left there, and there's a few things I've talked about today, so you can see the links at the bottom there to go and find out more yourself. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you, Phil. That was really very insightful. So we indeed have a couple of questions here. Let me just start with this one. How has COVID-19 affected your work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's affected everybody this year. There's been some fairly kind of tangible material things. At SciLife Lab, we've had a lot of rapid research projects kicked off around COVID, like nothing I've ever seen before. And so many of us working at the NGI have been kind of pulled off working on various projects, and those in the lab, some people have been volunteering to work in the actual test lab. So it's been kind of an interesting time for us. But it's also been very exciting seeing how the community has come together and the kinds of things we can build in a very short space of time. I think that viral recon pipeline that I showed, which is now being used for COVID analysis in a number of different countries, is a fantastic example where lots of research groups had the same problem at the same time all over the world, and we really worked together to build this fantastic pipeline, which is now being kind of used in a real world situation. So that kind of stuff makes me feel very optimistic and happy to be working in such a nice and open research environment.
Absolutely. Let's see. We have another one on is analysis on the cloud secure?
Yes. Yeah, the classic kind of fear. My personal view is that an analysis on the cloud is as secure as you make it. There isn't anything inherently insecure about cloud analysis. It's really just a question of you setting it up correctly, but that would be the same if you're setting up a local HPC compute system as well. The same problems are there in both situations. So it's something that every institute and everyone who wants to use the cloud has to kind of tackle and maybe convince the right people in the right places that it's okay. But I think as long as you follow those instructions that were in that research cloud program guide, you set up the right things in the right way, there's nothing inherently insecure about cloud compute.
Perfect. Then let's see, maybe we can take a couple of more questions here. Next one would be, how do you avoid accidentally overspending on cloud?
Yeah, I'm quite paranoid about this. If you start asking around, you don't have to go too far to find some scare stories of people racking up kind of horrifying costs with cloud computing, and we've had some small scale accidents ourselves, which have eaten through some research credits a bit faster than we'd like. So I think it's okay to be a bit paranoid, but the way that we do it is, or the way that I've done it is, when you set up your account, AWS has lots of different alarms and billing alerts and things that you can set up. So certainly to start off with, when I'm creating things, I set them to be basically 0. And if anything starts costing money, which I didn't expect, I get an email about it immediately. And then when things should be empty and not running, I periodically check that they're not costing money. And that kind of gives me confidence that things are set up as I expect, at least. And then after that, again, it's just setting up sensible automation for alerts for costing, so that if something does go wrong, you can stop it quickly.
Perfect. And then one more question before we move on, and please a short answer on that is cloud compute also suitable for small research groups?
Yeah, I think so. Today I've described the genomics infrastructure I work. We're a big national platform. I hopefully convinced you that we work with a lot of data, but that doesn't mean that it's only suitable for research groups like us. The cloud is pay as you go, so there's no upfront costs. So if you need to set up some kind of infrastructure to run your analysis, you can just get up and going almost immediately and only pay for what you use. So I would recommend using a workflow manager such as Nextflow for whatever kind of scale of analysis you're doing. It's good practice, it's reproducible, it makes your life easier, and it means you can scale later on if you want. But yeah, I don't think there's no reason to be scared of using these tools, even if you're only kind of handling a relatively small amount of data.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Phil. On the other questions, we'll get back to those questions with the responses on email. And with that said, Nicholas, we would like to hear from you and from AWS perspective.
Okay, so thanks, Phil, for that presentation. It's really inspiring. Okay, so welcome everyone to this webinar. Today I'm going to be talking about scaling your research with AWS. My name is Nico. I'm a data scientist. I'm working across EMEA with public sector organizations who are tackling really complex challenges, usually using machine learning at scale. So in this presentation, I'm going to give you an intro of how you can scale your research. And it's not going to be a complete guide of every tool that is out there to do this, but it should give you a glimpse of what's possible with AWS. So I'm going to split my presentation actually into two things, and then I'm going to leave some room for questions at the end. So the first bit is I'm going to be talking a bit about high performance computing and what type of workloads are used in this case and how you can scale them. And I'm going to show some use cases of other organizations that have done this and what was the result for them. Then I'm going to start talking about machine learning and how you can take your research into AWS and scale it, scale your training, scale your deployment, and the reducing the time to implementation. If we have enough time, I would like to show you also a very small example of how flexible AWS is at presenting your research. So let's start talking about high performance computing. In this case, Phil has mentioned a lot of the use case that he's been working on with genomics. So I understand high performance computing as solving the most complex problems. But one thing that I notice is that normally this the capacity to solve these issues is very constrained by the infrastructure that is available to researchers, right? So, for example, in this diagram that you see here on the screen, you can see that on the left we have the workloads versus the cores that are available on premise, right? And like Phil was mentioning before, in the past, maybe you have some new workloads. You have some workloads that are standard that you're used to running, but then maybe you have new experiments that you want to run, and they are very sporadic, right? So you would like to have this capacity of running new workloads without having to actually start provisioning new infrastructure, asking for new capacity, and reducing time to results, basically. So one question that we can ask is, if you have access to thousands of cores of your choice to your HPC infrastructure as you need them, you can add them as they are required, and then once you finish running your workload, you can just discard them, for example, effectively only paying for what you have used. So how will that kind of additional compute power improve your results? Let me give you one example. Last year, actually, in 2019, a data refinery called the Card Labs ran the first virtualized cluster for HPC applications and got into the top 500 supercomputers. For them, it only cost them $5,000 to complete. And the interesting thing about this is that they wanted to do it all by themselves. They wanted to check out if it's possible to actually have this self-service approach, right? We need it, we just pick it, and then we implement this at scale. So one of the things that they mentioned is that they charge this $5,000 to the company credit card, but the potential was palpable, since the cost to run this on custom hardware at the same speed would probably have costed $20 to $30 million. And of course, the maybe a year that you need to add to provision this hardware in advance, right? So what are some of the benefits of using HPC on AWS? So virtually you have unlimited infrastructure that is going to enable you to scale and do this at an agility that is not possible using on-premise. Also, one thing that you have is that you can always make sure that you have the latest versions of the software that you're running. You don't have to go back and have some Linux distribution that is very old, for example. You have instant access to the latest technologies. These workloads can be found across different industries. So you have life sciences, financial services, for example, climate and geoscience, and these are some of the customers that are using AWS for their custom workloads. And I'm also interested in sharing with you some of the use cases that these customers have done and how this has helped them scale their research. So for example, FredHatch actually decreased the time that it takes them to analyze biological samples from 7 years to 7 days, right? So they are a team of researchers who are engaged in the analysis of microbiome, right? So with this, they can get, in their own words, they can get closer to develop therapeutics to fight cancer. Another example of this is actually in the Australian Museum. So what they are doing is they are trying to sequence the koala genome, which is really interesting. And they are doing this using 3 million core hours of Amazon EC2 Spot capacity. And Spot is a very interesting concept because it's basically your there is unused compute capacity, and you can and this can go into an auction, and you can actually bid for that unused capacity, and when it becomes available, you can use it for your own research. The good thing about this is that the cost of doing this is actually 70 to 90% less than the normal cost for the same amount of compute. Then, for example, you have these financial institutions. They are running risk models up to 4,000 times faster. So they can effectively have the same result in hours instead of months. And this is something that I find very interesting, is Western Digital is actually accelerating the time to innovation and reducing the time to results, which was the thing that we were looking at in the previous slide, from 20 days to 8 hours, right? This is basically because of the capacity of scaling to virtually infinite CPU compute availability, right? So how does this look like, right? So on AWS, you can see that you can automatically create these clusters, you can operate them, and then you can just take them down in minutes, right? So you can see that you have the what you see here on the in the middle. This will be your cluster, and then it will be communicating to different applications, your data, your on-premise infrastructure, and this cluster that you have is very you can choose actually the hardware that goes inside. There are many different options that are available based on the type of workload that you're looking for, right? So if it's common compute workloads, for example, are using the C5, which is optimized for compute. But then, for example, if you're running machine learning workloads, you can use the P3 instances, which is an NVIDIA V100 that is running behind these instances, and this is going to accelerate the time to implementation, right? So I would like to mention two things, not a lot. Again, there are many different tools, but I will only like to focus on two things for running these HPC workloads at scale. And one of them is the Elastic Fabric Adapter, which is a network device that you can attach to the EC2 instances to bypass the kernel for fast network communication, right? So once you're using this EFA, tightly coupled HPC applications have access to lower and more consistent latency, right? And also you have higher throughput than traditional TCP channels. So why is this important? Because, for example, this means that this can scale really well. So you see here a line of the number of cores and then the scaling for, this is an application that is actually, let me put this here. So this is is running computational fluid dynamics on this aircraft. It's actually a fictional aircraft, but it's running this this computational fluid analysis on this, and you can see that that using EVA is the scaling is closer to the ideal scaling that you can have, right? So in this case, this was tested with great results on reducing the number of the time that it takes to run the same type of analysis, right? And then another thing that I wanted to mention is this idea of a parallel cluster, right? So this is an AWS supported open source cluster management tool that makes it really easy for you to deploy and manage these clusters on AWS. What this does is this supports a really wide variety of operating systems and batch schedulers, so you can migrate your existing workload with directly into AWS, right? This is also integrated with Batch, which is a scheduling system, FSX, which is a way for you to store and transmit data between these instances, and this EFA adapter that we saw in the past. So one thing that I wanted to mention, and this is important, is this is very relevant based on the questions that were asked to Phil in the previous presentation, is how you can keep track of your cost and how you can actually provision these instances, or what is the best and most efficient way of doing this, right? So one thing that that we notice is that, for example, in some cases, there is a lot of capacity that a lot of processing that you know that you're going to do. Is very constant, that amount of capacity. Maybe there is a seasonal some seasonal workloads or something that was unexpected that you want to run, and then that will actually move your capacity, your compute needs, right? So we have the concept of these three different ways of actually allocating compute resources, right? So one is reserve instances, which is when you actually know the amount of capacity that you need, right? So this gets a better price, basically, because you know the amount of compute that you're going to need. On demand is when you want to finish something in a particular amount of time, for example, and you want the resources to be available to you alone. And then you have a spot when, like we mentioned before, it's the case when you don't really mind if the processing might take a bit longer, but you get the best price out there, right? So one thing that was mentioned before was how can we keep track of how much everything is costing us, right? So one thing that we can do is actually use AWS services to manage, analyze, and visualize the operational metrics for each of the shops that we are running, right? So we have, for example, here you can see the cost per project and how much each team is spending. You can do the same thing in this way using AWS Cost Explorer, and you can see how the cost is evolving and the usage as well. Okay, so I would like to take a deep breath now. That was a lot of information referred to high performance computing, but this is, I also wanted to talk a bit about machine learning, and this is actually my area of my domain of expertise. I have seen many organizations approaching machine learning and at scale, moving their workloads from on-prem to the cloud, looking to first decrease the time that it takes for their teams to actually reach an implementation stage experiment with ideas, because one thing that happens is that maybe they have an idea and they want to get from data to paper faster, right? So how can AWS help into that experimentation? And then once you have something that works, how you can take that thing that works and put it into a safe environment that can scale quickly to thousands or maybe millions of users, right? So so you can think of the machine learning stack at Amazon as being composed of three things. So the thing at the bottom is actually the infrastructure, the frameworks. These are the deep learning AMIs, for example, that are available. These are everything that you can do to the hardware itself, custom to your use case, right? So this is highly complex and is available to you. If you are a data scientist like myself and you want to experiment with an idea, then the platform of choice is called Amazon SageMaker, which is basically an end-to-end platform that is doing most of the things that you will need as a data scientist, for example, collecting the data, pre-processing the data, looking for an algorithm, training a model and tuning that model, experimenting, and then finally deploying that model into production, and as well having a loop of how all of this works, right? And then one thing that is also available is that there's a high-level APIs. There are high-level APIs that you can very quickly call in case you don't want to build a solution just to recognize an image, for example, or to use to detect text out of a PDF document. You might not want to just develop something from scratch. So you can use an API that is very efficient to give you the results back and build upon that on your solution, right? So this is what Amazon SageMaker Studio in this case looks, which is for those of you who are familiar with Jupyter Notebooks, these are Python interactive environments where you can run Python code in these cells, right? And the good thing about this is that, for example, in this case, we are actually updating a model, right? So you can see at the bottom that you can easily provision a training cluster. You can see there that I can choose the number of instances that I want to be running this training shop, and then you can also see the type of instance that I'm going to use. So I can choose, for example, one that has a GPU or not. On the left, you can see that you have access to, you have a Git integration, you can run experiments, and you can also deploy, finally, once the model is trained, you can deploy it using one click, and that is going to be available for use, and it's going to scale basically automatically based on the demand to that endpoint. So one thing that we have found that customers who are looking to build and deploy new models basically reduce 60 to 90% the development time, just because it's easier to get data in, tuning, training. They get a huge reduction in the time that it takes to develop something, and the deployment effort is reduced massively, almost 90%. One thing also is that when you're looking to improve your existing models, you can get around 20x speed up when you're looking for doing search in the parameters, for example. And just to give you an idea, there is also something that is called autopilot, which is when you have tabular data sets, basically like for example, the data that is coming from accelerometers through many different sensors through time. Using autopilot, you can actually create experiments really quickly, and the algorithm that will get chosen at the very end will be the best resulting. So SageMaker will automatically start to run a set of tests, and it's going to come back with the best result. So you can see here that this is for the same toggle competition. This was determining the number of available beds at a hospital. You can see that the processing time is very small, and the total time that it takes from idea, from data, to actually having something that is better than other solutions is very quick, basically. This is something that the Westmont College has actually used for their solution for detecting cerebral palsy in children. For them, they were using this automatic model tuning to get to actually outperform the published state-of-the-art by 10% in a very quick and easy way, like the Professor Donald Patterson was saying, with far less work than the previous 10% required. Okay, so want to check again how much time I got available. So I wanted to show you a very quick example of an implementation of an idea, of a challenge. When you're presented with a challenge and you want to come back with a solution really quick, how can you do it, and how can you do it at scale? This is something that I myself work with. The Ashmolean Museum, which is related to the University of Oxford, they have the biggest digital collection of Roman provincial coins available in the world. And one thing that they had a challenge with was how to automate the appraisal of coins. And what that means is that when, for example, they have only one expert or a very few number of experts with the right knowledge to look at a picture of a coin or look at a physical coin and then actually saying, I think this is the one. So one thing that they approach us with this challenge and ask, how can we use machine learning to solve this? So one thing that we started working on and thinking is, okay, so can we take images that are not taken with a professional equipment, for example, with perfect light or perfect focus or a perfect camera, and might be taken with a cell phone, for example, a smartphone, because someone has found, or some institution in the other side of the world has found some object that might be a Roman provincial coin, and they want basically to validate if that's the case. So this situation would normally involve weeks of time just for preparation, pre-processing of the image itself until it looks in a way that is easy for the expert to actually tell apart if this is the coin or is a different one. So you can see how these images look ideally in this digital collection. But we started looking at this problem in this way. So can we take, for example, the image on the left, where there is a background, right? The background is blurry, there is a coin, but it's rotated, the image is low resolution, and can we return a set of objects that look similar to that coin? So that's what we wanted to tackle. And for that, we use a very simple architecture, right? So to the training data, and then we created a cluster for training. And this is what I wanted to show you is, in this case, there are many different models that need to be run for doing this. There is a model for detecting a coin, a model for removing the background, a model for enhancing the image quality that you have, a model for determining if the coin is the front of the coin or the back of the coin, if the coin belongs to what region of the world, what is the material of this coin. So there is a lot of experimentation, and this can take months, but we didn't want to spend months. So that's why, for example, in this case, you can see that I launched all of these training shops at the same time. And this is something that and all of these are different models that are being run. And you can see that using spot instances, instead of, actually the training time was 2 hours, but because I was using spot, the actual time was less than half an hour, right? So, and that's why the cost to train this model is actually only $2, for example. This is just to give you an idea of how easy it is to actually scale training and experiment much quicker with this. And just wanted to show you a very quick demo of what this looks like. You can see that here, for example, you choose an image. This is the image, and then you will have to first detect the coin, detect the shape of the coin, removing the background, and then auto-rotating the coin, and then auto-scaling it, right? So reducing the blur in the picture. And you can see now that that this has been done in a few seconds. This was a process that used to take a lot of time before, done by a number of volunteers. And then we take that information and we start predicting. For example, is it the front of the coin? Is it the back? It belongs to Egypt? Where? Then finally, once we have all of these features, we go to the database, and we get information on the similar results, right? You can see that you get the most similar results. So now the task, instead of looking at thousands of coins, you only look at the most similar ones. So this is an example of how you can take an idea, start experimenting really quickly, and then having a demo of what this looks like in reality, right? And every model that you saw is actually deployed in production, so it can scale based on the type of demand that we have. So just very briefly, I also wanted to show you how flexible AWS is. And one thing that I noticed, especially with research, is that it's very hard to share to very diverse audiences how useful the research is. So how can we share this in a way that is engaging to tech audiences and non-tech audiences, right? So one thing that I noticed is that, for example, in my case with machine learning, I normally share my screen. I have a notebook full of code, and then the result is that data scientists and techies can follow what non-techies can quickly get lost. So I'm not going to go into much detail with this, but basically this example, and you can look this later in the instructions that are shown in the repo. This is a demo for doing for using an adversarial network that is going to remove a person or an object from an image, right? And for this, it's using machine learning. But the good thing about it is that with less than 10 lines of code, you can actually deploy all the infrastructure to AWS. And you can see here that is actually deploying all of this. And then at the very end, you get a website that is available online and that also scales and can show basically your research in a more engaging way. So this way, you can actually show the results of your research quicker, and you can show the value that it has. And again, this is done in maybe 10 to 15 minutes. All of the infrastructure is deployed in a way that you don't have to see it. And then once this is finished, for example, let's say for a particular event, you can actually just go back and remove the resources, and that's it. And you don't have to spend any extra money. So hopefully that's been useful. I know this is a lot of content, but feel free to reach out if you have any type of questions. And I really appreciate the time that you have taken for this webinar. Thank you.
Great, Nico. Thank you so much. I think we have a little bit of time left. So let me just check on questions that we have. Here is one. I think this relates to the machine learning part that you presented. How can we make sure that we don't go over planned budget when running experiments?
Sure. So that's actually one of the biggest things that you have to watch out for. And I think that Phil was talking about the same issue. So like he was saying, there are a lot of alarms that you can set. You can tag resources basically to specific uses or specific projects that you're working on. And you can tag these resources in a way that you're going to get an alarm. Whenever you set a particular amount, for example, and want this to go over $10, you will get an alarm when the expenses are getting close to that value. And so that way you can actually know exactly how much this is costing you for each particular project that you're running. So there are many different ways of doing this.
Great. Thank you. I think we are a little bit tight in the timing. So the other questions, Nico will definitely get back to you, and to the questions that we didn't manage to get through and were addressed to Phil. Of course, Phil will get back to you. With that said, thank you for joining this webinar, and thank you to our speakers as well for a great insight they shared. And we are looking forward to meet you again at our next webinar in the AWS Nordics Spotlight series. Thank you very much.